When we last looked at the dynamic web client, we'd already written a few of the more straightforward BBJ controls, such as buttons, checkboxes, and a basic text input field. Those controls were low-hanging fruit, as they already had an HTML counterpart, meaning that we could create a BBJ button that was an HTML button under the covers with some extra embellishments. Since then, we've been expanding the infrastructure to support adding new controls and have produced several of the more complex BBJ controls as web components. From the framework standpoint, the new client now supports resizable windows, form validation, tooltips, user properties, system metrics, and more. And when it comes to new controls, we now have several of the complex control types implemented as web components. That means that the new client can now run programs that use input E, input D, and input N controls, as well as the spinner versions of each of those. And BBJ message boxes, which we first made using the JavaScript alert function, are now full-blown styled controls with built-in intelligence to handle changing screen sizes, user dragging, and positioning to ensure that it's always contained in the visible client bounds. Last time we showed an example of how the new client supported responsive design by switching off BBJ's normal management of control sizes and positions. The demo included a reproduction of the product download page's contact form and used Bootstrap for layout. For this video, we'll look at a Flexbox-based layout that uses BBJ custom classes to define container, row, and column objects. The top half of the form gives us access to a subset of the Flexbox properties that control the layout of the boxes in the bottom half. Even though Flexbox has many more properties than the demo exposes, it should be enough to give us a taste of what's possible when we use it to create responsive apps. The first property that we'll play with is Flex Direction, where we can switch from a row-based layout to one that's column-based. And both of those support reverse directions as well. Next up is alignment, and we have a few different options to justify the boxes in the container. The boxes are left aligned at the Flex Start position, but we can change that to the Flex End position to right align them. Centering controls in a container is common, and we can choose from different spacing patterns. For example, we can divide the unused space equally between the boxes. This spacing applies regardless of the number of controls in the container. The space around takes another approach and ensures that each control has the same amount of space on both sides. Notice that the container background has vertical dividers to help us compare the amount of spacing on each side of the boxes. The Space Evenly option is similar, but collapses the spacing between the boxes. Flexbox also has several properties for the controls within the container. It's possible to specify the control order and how the controls grow and shrink relative to one another. Right now, none of the boxes have their growth factor set, but using the last list box, we can set unique growth patterns. Growing the boxes equally starts to get interesting when we increase the number of boxes or resize the window. Note that the top half of our program is responsive as well, wrapping the groups as the window width shrinks. The Small Outers option is a common layout choice for web page bodies that have narrow sidebars and a wider center for the main content. And since we can choose any grow values that we want, and they're all relative to one another, we can have the boxes increase or decrease in width. They can even be in a pyramid pattern where they're smaller on the sides and larger in the middle. It's easy to get caught up in the new layout capabilities, so it's worth mentioning that the new client retains backward compatibility with the BUI client, in that we can opt to skip the flow layout and continue using BBJ's traditional size and positioning approach. And speaking of being compatible, the new client supports both read-record event loops and callbacks like the BUI client. Additionally, if your app relies on resource files to define the controls and layout, that's supported as well. Earlier we mentioned that writing the BBJ controls as web components would help us by ensuring that the controls look like one another. As part of that, we're enforcing consistent parameters such as fonts, colors, borders, shadows, focus indicators, and even animation speeds. But those aren't all hard-coded to the same value for each control. They're implemented using CSS variables. CSS variables weren't available when we first introduced Buoy, and they've gained widespread support over the last few years. They are also dynamic, meaning that Basis can provide a default set of values and customers can change the values at any time. This opens the door for theming, as anyone can define their own set of preferred values for fonts, colors, borders, etc. To illustrate this, the demo includes a color picker that lets us alter the value of the Basis primary color CSS variable. Note that each browser has its own idea of a color picker, and Firefox's is particularly powerful. We can select any color we want in a variety of ways, using a color wheel or choosing from a predefined palette. Whenever we make a selection, the program sets the Basis primary color CSS variable to our chosen color. We can even channel our inner artist and use colored pencils to pick a color. While the new client still supports custom CSS like Buoy, it's much easier for non-programmers to alter their app's appearance by specifying a new value for any of the CSS variables. So instead of writing hundreds of lines of CSS to change every BBJ control, all that's needed is a few tweaks to a handful of variables and voila! A new theme is born. For example, we can apply a set of custom CSS variable values as a group to produce a red theme with a custom font. When we change the value once more, we have a green theme with huge rounded borders. Although it isn't a direct comparison, the Buoy mortgage program takes 385 lines of low-level CSS code to customize the app's appearance. In contrast, the purple theme sets a handful of CSS variables and only requires 13 lines of text. We can even define a dark theme by setting the color variables to unconventional values. The new client continues to progress as we complete more controls and expand its capabilities. Even though there's a lot left to do, we've made tremendous progress and have added innovative features that should spark imaginations and compel developers to try it out.